Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Shortcuts to Public Speaking Success and also to my video blog. My name is Shola Kaye. I'm a communication specialist based in London with clients around the world, and I'm very excited today to have a little something different for you. And some of you may not know that I also have talks and deliver consulting on empathy in the workplace, because I feel it's all communication, and especially with the background that I had in the workplace initially, where I was in a situation where I felt I was kind of not included with what was going on around me. I think it's particularly important to focus on empathy, listening skills, and everything that goes with it, as well as the communication where we're actually delivering a message to others. So today I'm very excited because I have a consultant with me, and she's going to share some information about how we can speak up in the workplace when perhaps we're under fire or we're under pressure. And the way that I met Baljit, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, was I was writing an article for HR Zone and on empathy at work, and Baljit saw that article and got in touch, and here we are just a few days later running this podcast together. So it's super exciting. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Baljit Kaur, and I'm super excited to have her here today. And Baljit helps companies design a diverse workforce and inclusive cultures, achieving excellence in diverse employee attraction, engagement, and retention. She's delivered a range of innovative training and consultancy interventions with particular expertise in unconscious bias, dignity at work, inclusive leadership, inclusive recruitment, and talent management workshops. And she's also on various boards. She belongs to various groups, and yeah, she's very eminent and very excited to have her here today. So Baljit, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Shola. I'm really pleased to be sharing my insights with yourselves.
Super. Well, as I mentioned before, this is something a little different for me and for my audience, having guests, first of all, having guests on the show, and then also moving more towards this work on inclusive leadership, talent management, diversity. So I'm looking forward to sharing your insights with my audience. And I'm going to ask you a few questions, but of course, you know, feel free to go wherever you'd like to with this interview. And as I mentioned, public speaking, it's not all about being prepared or standing up in front of an audience and you know, getting yourself ready. Sometimes where we're in the workplace, we might be facing difficult situations in front of a group, or perhaps it might even be a Q&A and there's some hostile people in the audience. So I'd love to hear from you what your advice is for people regarding standing up for themselves or dealing with tricky situations like that they perhaps didn't see coming, or they feel a bit blindsided.
So I think the point that you've just started off with there, Shola, in terms of that speak up culture is really what organizations need to aim for. How do they develop cultures which are inclusive, and what do we mean by inclusive cultures? Well, the key indicator of an inclusive culture is whether people feel that they can speak up. So be it your situation that you just described there, that you're under pressure, you know, somebody's landed something onto you and you now need to respond, or be it a speak up culture where, you know, you feel that you're being undermined or you've been devalued, which is generally the experience that people share with me when I work with organizations, or they've received inappropriate comments or behavior towards them. And they need to basically be brave and be able to speak up. So that's a common issue that I come across in organizations, is how do we develop speak up cultures? And essentially what we're saying there is, do we have, first of all, the bedrock in order for people to be able to feel confident in speaking up? And when I refer to bedrock, it's really referring to all communication in an organization is influenced by the context in which it's taking place. And that really means, do we first of all have that bedrock in place, a bedrock of trust, where I feel that should I inadvertently say something wrong, or should I be on the receiving end of an inappropriate comment, language, behavior, whatever that might be, then I feel that there is enough trust in the organization that should I speak up, I will not be reprimanded, I will not be ridiculed, I will not be humiliated, and my voice will be heard. So that issue around trust and creating that psychological safety is really, really important. I need to know that the organisation and my employer has got my back and my best interest at heart. So trust is first of all fundamental. And then I think secondly, there's an issue around, you talked earlier, the words you used were around, say, empathy. We talk about some of those tender qualities being kindness and vulnerability. So how do we ensure that we know what our individual values are? Because if I'm going to stay true to my values, I need to know what those are. For example, one of the key values I have is empathy. In the work that I do around diversity and inclusion, empathy is a key ingredient. So how am I ensuring that I am demonstrating empathy, and how am I ensuring that I am in touch with my values? I don't think we do enough work in organisations, in workplaces, where we actually get people in touch with their values. We talk about these in a very trite sense. I'd like to be kind, I'd like to be empathetic, but do I actually understand what that means in practice, and how do I demonstrate it consistently? So the whole issue around values and being true to your values is key to this speak up culture. And I think the third point there I'd like to make is around techniques. Speaking up and providing somebody with feedback or challenging something that's happened in an organisation requires technique, and sometimes we take that for granted. So we think feedback and challenge is a common sense issue. We should know how to do this. But it's a technique, and we have to teach people what that technique is. And that's an organisational responsibility, because done in the wrong way, if I have to stand up for myself, whatever the issue might be, I need to be able to do it in a constructive and effective way. Done in the wrong way, I have created tension. I have possibly not preserved that relationship with the individual that I'm addressing, in which case, what was the point of me speaking up? The whole idea with speaking up is that I am respecting my rights, I'm respecting the rights of the other person, and I'm able to provide that feedback in a constructive way. And that's a technique. So that technique that I thought a good model for people to actually think about when they're thinking about techniques is the Dr. Eric Burns model. In its 1960s models, it's referred to as the Transactional Analysis, and it's got 3 stages within it. So when we have an exchange with each other, that communication, that's known as a transaction. And there's 3 stages that we can adopt. We can adopt a parent mode, an adult mode, or a child mode. So let's take an example to make this real. So if, for example, there's some banter in the workplace, which is, say, commonplace, and I receive a comment such as, you look good enough to eat today. So somebody's kind of paying me a compliment, but not quite a compliment. So when that comment is made, I have a choice as to how I respond to that. When I respond to that, I can either take the parent mode and say, what you said was sexist. So that's almost reprimanding, like a parent would do with a child. Or I could be a little bit patronizing and say something like, oh, well, that's what I expected you to say. That's the kind of behavior I expect from you. That approach is not going to bring effective change with that individual. The child approach would be, in response to that comment, I might not say anything. I might just sit there and fold my arms and roll my eyes and shrug my shoulders, in total disregard of the fact that that kind of behavior is not going to create effective change in the other person. So I might take a childlike approach, or say something like, oh, I'm sorry, I've got a boyfriend, or whatever that might look like. What the model actually says to organizations is, wherever that exchange occurs, when you're standing up for yourself, when you're looking to provide feedback and challenge, it's the adult stage that we need to adopt. We need to have adult to adult conversations. And an adult to adult conversation would be an assertive conversation. The parent mode was very much aggressive. The child mode was passive aggressive. And adult mode is assertive. So how can we be assertive in giving that communication? And there are techniques involved in terms of being assertive within the workplace. So again, just taking that example, I might say something like, when you said you look good enough to eat, I felt devalued, disrespected, and expand upon that. So we're dissociating the behavior from the individual So we're not saying the individual is racist, sexist, whatever those, big words might be. But we're actually saying your behavior was inappropriate. So there are techniques involved in how we stand up to ourselves, as well as how we provide feedback and challenge. So really those 3 stages in terms of, first of all, building the climate of trust, second, ensuring we've done some work around values of the organisation, values of the individual, and thirdly, we've equipped people with the tools and the strategies to be able to provide feedback in that effective and constructive way.
That's really helpful, Baljeet. I've come across transactional analysis before quite a few times, and it's always seemed really helpful. And in fact, I've used it with my parents, a few times with that sort of adult, instead of me jumping back to being a sort of reactive kid, getting all hurt or upset. So I really like that. And I hope that's going to be useful to people out there, because I think quite often we do respond in that kind of knee-jerk way, don't we? Either it's like slap their wrist, or, oh, you've hurt me. And neither one of those responses are particularly helpful. So that's really useful. Thank you for that. So the next thing I'd like to ask about is, in terms of, now so many people are dispersed, obviously, because we are working from home. So what can companies do in terms of giving people a voice, enabling them to speak up, even though they're spread out? Because, I was talking to a friend of mine in HR the other day, and we were talking about situations where, people can be sidelined in the office. But imagine, you're already not in the sort of the golden group at work, and then now suddenly everyone's at home. How much easier is it for you to be left out to dry, hung out to dry, or kind of left out on your own without support? So I'm just curious about perhaps what you're observing during this working from home period, and any tips you could have for perhaps for individuals who are feeling like they're being, they're just not being included, and they're just thinking, well, how can I get further back into things? And I know that's a cultural issue as well. So maybe you could address it both from the work culture, office culture, and then also from an individual standpoint.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a hard question, I know.
I've been speaking to a number of employers and employees in the last few weeks to understand what their experience is and what their perspective is, because we are in almost new territory at this moment in time. And it's really interesting in that the kinds of issues that people are facing in this sort of remote working environment very much stem back from the workplace. So I've spoken to individuals who are saying that we felt totally disengaged within the workplace. We didn't feel valued, we didn't feel respected, we didn't feel included. And now this remote working situation has just exacerbated that issue for them, that experience for them, because it's almost like they're further out of sight now. So they're going to be further out of mind. And as you've just said, in terms of that power group, we do psychologically form in groups and out groups all the time. We don't do it physically, we psychologically, in our minds, are forming in groups and out groups all the time. People that are similar to us, people that are like us are likely to be in our in group, people that are not, people that ordinarily we wouldn't hang out with, other people that are in our out group. So in this situation, when you're further out of sight, there is a danger here. There is a high risk that that kind of tendency to differentiate in that way is going to be greater. So in terms of the current arrangements, I think that's a great risk. Organizations that have done some investment in terms of, biases, be that conscious bias, subconscious, unconscious, however, one wants to frame it, they'll be in a better situation, because what they might need is just a bit of a reminder to say, hey, people, just watch out for your biases, and this situation might actually exacerbate those. In which case they can kind of keep them in check, because they'll have done some work around techniques and strategies. But organizations that haven't invested in upskilling their employees around unconscious bias, what it is, how it manifests, and what might be the tools and strategies and techniques that people should deploy, more so now than before, then they won't be in a good position. And for me, one of the risks of the current environment is this whole issue around the separation and differentiation between people will be very prominent. In a workplace, you can have some water cooler conversations. I've just popped over to the water cooler, and there might be somebody that ordinarily I don't know, wouldn't hang out with, but you spark up a conversation. You know, you get to know people a little bit better. But now those water cooler conversations have gone. If I want to speak to somebody, I'm very likely to pick up the phone to somebody in my in-group as opposed to somebody in my out-group. So that issue for organisations is quite a stark issue in terms of how do they ensure that they're still creating those inclusive cultures and bringing people together. Some organisations, from an organisation's point of view, have got a bit of good practice in this area. So there are some organisations that are actively, obviously, providing support around mental health and anxiety. But they're going a little bit further, and they're sort of, one organisation, a really good example was they've got almost a label for each day of the week. So Mondays might be Mojo Monday, and they'll spend an hour talking about, you know, what's everyone's mojo and who's lost their mojo and who's, you know, retained it and what strategies they've used. Then there might be a Wellbeing Wednesday, or there might be a Thankful Thursday. You know, let's do some journaling around how we're feeling and being grateful for what we have got. So putting things into that perspective. So some people have gone a little bit further. Some have introduced engagement around, say, quizzes or showing short videos and saying, let's have a discussion around this. And it might be around resilience, or it might have nothing to do with workplace skills and traits. It might be something completely random. But it's just about how do we continue to have that inclusive communication and ensure in that process that everybody's voice is heard. For some people, this arrangement will work. You know, for me, for example, I'm an extreme introvert. So for me, you know, working from home in the sanctuary of my home, no distractions, I don't rely on sort of that face-to-face time like an extrovert would. So for me, this is like business as usual, and, you know, this is my ideal working, you know, norm, if you like. For other people, they'll be going stir crazy. They'll be climbing the walls. They rely on that face-to-face. You know, people with disability, maybe somebody on the autism and Asperger's spectrum, this might be ideal for them. They don't require those Monday Mojo sessions and all the rest of it. You know, they're productive and happy and content, you know, within their four walls, so to speak. So it really does depend on that sort of, what we need to bring into mind is that concept of individuality. For some, this will work, for some, it won't work. How do we understand our people, and how do we ensure that we're communicating with them in the way that suits them best?
Fantastic, that's really helpful. I'm just going to plug in my laptop. Lucky it's right here. Rookie mistake there. Let's pop that
While
in.
you're doing that, Shola, I'll just step in with one other thing.
Yes,
just come to mind. In this process, it's really, really important, yes, to have that individual approach, but also take the opportunity to collect people's experiences. Because when there comes a time when we're sort of deciding what the new norm should look like for our businesses and our people, we need to understand what were people's experiences. What were the things that worked well? What are the positives we want to take forward? What are the things that we want to shelve? So it's really important to do that as we're going along.
Interesting. And a lot of it obviously rests on the shoulders of the organisation. Is there anything as an individual that people can do, or is it really, it's just tough if you're in one of those groups where you're in the out group, or you're not privy to, you know, that information that's going to help you still progress your career while people are working from home? Is there anything that we can do on an individual level? I guess it does come down to trust to be able to go to HR or a supervisor and speak up, but I'd love to hear from you and your expertise on this.
Well, I think it's important that, yes, people do feel empowered to do so, but even if the climate isn't the most conducive to a speak up culture, individuals still need to take some responsibility, because if we don't, then the culture will perpetuate, and any injustices and inequalities will continue to perpetuate and just be reinforced at the time. So absolutely, people need to speak up, just regardless of what their surrounding is. It's almost taking ownership for yourself and your trajectory with that workplace. And I think then the onus on the individual is just to ensure that they've skilled themselves up in terms of some of those feedback and challenge techniques that we spoke about earlier, because done in the wrong way, you can create more damage. So if we want things to land most effectively, how do we ensure that we are asking thoughtful questions? We are positioning and framing things in the most positive way. So it's not a blame culture. It's just saying that with this happening, whatever the situation might be, this is how I'm feeling, or this has been the impact on my life. This is what I need. So, when organizations say, bring us problems and bring us solutions. So, be prepared to raise the issue, but also have some suggestions for the organizations as to what might work, or what is it that you require. So absolutely have those constructive discussions, and you might be surprised, whilst we say it might be a cultural issue, not everybody within that culture will think and behave in the same way. So HR generally are more compassionate, more open, more receptive. But if you frame things in the right way and take ownership for your part in that process, then absolutely.
Interesting. And if people, oh gosh, I've got all echoey. Let's turn this down a bit. So if people want to skill themselves up, let's say that you work for an organization that isn't big on training, and you feel like you want to get some of these skills yourself, are there websites or are there places that people can go to that have a bit of information on these techniques, these sort of speaking up techniques and challenge techniques, that they can just at least empower themselves with those skills?
Okay, so
because I
was going to say off the top of my head. However, there are plenty. So whilst I can't, I may not be able to. A specific website might not come to mind, but there are plenty of websites. So websites and information around, first of all, things like values and how you align yourself to your values, because your values will be your guiding principles. If you say, for example, kindness is a value, or empathy is a value, or being respectful is a value, then the way that you provide that communication to the other person, these principles, these values should be your guiding principles. So you want it to land in that way. So if that's the case, then how do you frame it in the context of your values? So I think doing some work around values, I know there is an organization, I was on their webinar just the other day. It's called Service Brand, and they do a lot of work in terms of 31 days. So they have, so if you pick a value of empathy, over the period of 31 days, you can actually do some work in terms of how you go about demonstrating that value. Because the thing with values is you need to, one, keep them in your conscience, so they don't just fall off the radar. They're not just trite words. You need to bring those concepts into practice. But for human behavior to be sustainable, it needs to be repetitive. We need to rehearse and practice it. So what this tool does is over 31 days enable you to practice that technique in the hope that then you'll be able to sustain that behavior going forward. Because I like to say I'm empathetic, but am I empathetic with my daughter? Am I empathetic with my employer? Am I empathetic, so how do I do it consistently? Because that's the behavioral change. So that might be something people might want to look into. The other thing people might want to look into is positive affirmation and self-help. So just ensuring that you, regardless of your situation, you're taking responsibility for your mental health and well-being. And there's lots out there in terms of positive affirmations and well-being. And in terms of feedback and challenge techniques, I'm not sure you'll find something in one place, but certainly if you look at you just maybe type in feedback and challenge questioning techniques, then that might be a good place to start, because that will then give you those open-ended questions which usually land better and provoke that thinking and that reflection, because that's what your questions are meant to do. Rather than me telling you, Shola, when you did this, it came across like this, because you might get your back up and be a little bit defensive. Whereas if I actually use some questions which are almost coaching you to think about the language and behavior that you potentially used, you might not even know the impact of what you just said and done. Yeah. So giving you the benefit of the doubt, I'll be asking you some thoughtful, open-ended questions. When you said X, Y, and Z, I'm really interested to know where you were coming from, or what did you mean by that? So it gets you to do that self-reflection, you to do that thinking for yourself. And that's where the attitudinal shift will come, from where you are to where you want to be, rather than, you should do this and you shouldn't do that. Because that kind of approach isn't very effective.
That's fascinating. Really interesting. There's a lot there to unpack, really, because you talked about the values, that's something that I often ask people to look at in terms of their speaking, because quite often we judge ourselves or we rate ourselves against these, famous speakers or whatever it might be. But if you know your values as a communicator, that's what you should be looking to achieve. It's not something else that's quite amorphous that is almost impossible to manage. So that's super helpful. And then also this service brand, I'll have to check that out. So the 31 days. Did you say service brand as in?
Service brand, yes. Alan Williams is the person who delivered the webinar, and I believe that's his company. I haven't come across the company before, but I thought the webinar was really useful. And what was useful is this whole issue around you have to practice, and you have to, to get that behavior change in place, you have to practice your values almost on a daily basis.
Fantastic. So Alan Williams, I'll check that out and put the link in. Because again, that's something else that I run a course on empathy and a keynote, and I challenge people to do a 30 or 60 day empathy challenge afterwards. So they actually have to just figure out who should I be speaking to at the workplace, or who do I not speak to that I can actually open a conversation with in a dialogue, and then challenge people to actually make those connections on a regular basis for a month or a couple of months. So that's I'll definitely check out that service brand and see how that works with what I'm doing. And then finally, the feedback and the challenge technique. Again, this idea of asking coaching questions, because I think what's helpful there is to when you're using these sorts of techniques, you're no longer seeing yourself as a victim of, oh, they said this to me, or oh, this is what happened. You're actually playing a very active role in not only helping the person that made those comments to kind of progress and move forward, but I think that kind of focus then takes a lot of the energy, that kind of negative energy away, and you're trying to actually transmute it into positivity. And I think that can always help, because then you don't feel like, oh, I'm being victimized, or this is obviously you might still feel that anyway, because it depends on the extent, but yeah, the idea that there's something positive that you can do that can change things, and doesn't have you just in a corner thinking, oh gosh, I have to take this. So I think that's
because you single-handedly may not be able to change the culture of the organization, but it's taking ownership for what you can do.
Yeah, really, really helpful. Fantastic. Well, this is, great tips here. Lots and lots and lots to work on, for me and hopefully for my listeners as well. Because I'm all about, obviously, a lot of things need to happen at the enterprise level and the organization level. But I think whatever we can try and do ourselves as individuals will make us feel empowered and no longer in a victim-like situation, because we can actually take action. So this has been super helpful. So Baljeet, as we come to the end of our session today, I'd love you to share a little bit about how people can get in touch with you, or what they can do next if they've particularly enjoyed listening to you speak today. So please do go ahead.
Okay, so contact details, I think my LinkedIn profile is probably the best source of information. That will have all my contact details. So that will be baljit.core. So that's just spelling my name, Baljit, and core is spelled Kaur, just so you do get the right person. So Baljit Core on LinkedIn, and my consultancy is Innate Consultancy, INNATE. And very much, yes, we cover the gamut of diversity and inclusion issues, and also some of these self-help techniques around some of these, how do we develop empathy and kindness and vulnerability, those tender qualities, which often get overlooked in workplaces. We're very good at sort of, the analytical, systematic, task-focused, but what about some of this stuff, which is really, really important in terms of problem solving, building relationships, building trust, etc., as well as all the things that we do in terms of diversity and inclusion. But certainly my LinkedIn profile and my website, innateconsultancy.co.uk, and I am posting videos and articles all the time, so just tap into my LinkedIn and you can get all that information.
Excellent. I want to thank you so much and acknowledge you for all the great stuff that you shared today, because I think there's a lot of people out there who are struggling a bit in this situation where they're working from home. Maybe they've got a challenging home situation as well as a challenging work situation, and sometimes work is the relief, it's the release to get away from home, sometimes it's the other way around, but it's a tough time for many out there. So I think a lot of what you've shared will bring people some relief and help them to kind of change things, or at least feel that they're empowered to make changes. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Baljit, and wishing you all the best with your business.
Thank you very much for having me, Shola. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Perfect. Take care.